My name is Mike Ostler, and we have here some of the memorabilia from my time in the Royal Air Force, 1956 to 1968. After my Scottish adventures, I was posted to 205 Squadron in Singapore. I met Kathy, who was a nursing sister at the RAF hospital at Changi, and we got married, and she's still looking after me, like any good trained nurse should do. There's a picture of us in our tropical uniforms. We got married in Singapore, which was quite an event.
Where?
At the main registry office in Canning Rise, I think, somewhere there in the centre. But afterwards, we had a big reception in the grounds of a huge bungalow that Major Rogers was a friend of mine. He had this huge grounds around his bungalow, and he invited us there to have the sort of wedding celebrations. So virtually the whole Changi hospital shut down and everyone turned up except a few nurses who stayed on duty. But occasionally the sad side was that in Singapore Harbour, which was full of the craft going backwards and forwards all over the place, ferry boats would collide or turn turtle. And I can remember spending all night flying round, helping to find the survivors from a big ferry that had capsized in the middle of Singapore Harbour. And we had flares that we could drop from our aircraft with a little parachute on them. And they came down. It took about 5 minutes, I think, for it to actually get to the water. But it burnt this phosphorus, so it was like a waterfall of light from the aircraft downwards to the sea. And it meant that the people with the little boats down below had a chance of hooking survivors out of the water. They did. They didn't get them all, but they did get an awful lot of people out of the water while they were still alive. You don't really want to be dropped in the middle of Singapore Harbour. It's not the most friendly location to be in.
Is the logbook covering that? Can you find that incident?
Oh, well, yes, I'm sure we can. Let's see what we can find the detail on it. Right. So, yes, it was in the evening, 24th of November 1961, and the ferry in Singapore Harbour was called the Naga, N-A-G-A, and it capsized, and there were hundreds of people flopping around in the water, and they desperately needed some more light because all they had was a few police boats with a few little searchlights on, but they didn't have big ones in those days. So they wanted us to drop our parachute flares, which someone had seen, obviously, working. So we loaded up the aircraft with them, and they would drop like little bombs. You could fit 15 of them, I think, in the bomb bay. Then they burnt for about 5 minutes each, so that was going to be an hour and a half or something, perhaps, more or less continuous light. We just fly around and drop the next one just before the last one went out. And this is what we did. We actually flew from Changi. We dropped about an hour and a half's worth of flares, and then we went back and landed at Changi. According to this, 2 hours, 50 minutes night flying. Yep, that's it. And they did hook a lot of them out of the water live. So that was that one. Now, while we're on life-saving, I must mention this one here, which is August 1961. The Royal Air Force in Singapore, apart from Changi where we were based, they had another 2 bases. They had Seletar in the middle of the island, and at the west end of the island they had Tengah. And Tengah was a base for Javelin fighters, which was a 2-seater fighter. You had a pilot at front and navigator behind him, and that was the bee's knees in jet fighters in those days. And they were flying out a couple replacements from England to Singapore in August 61. and they had to stage and refuel on their way through. And this particular one had been into Dum Dum, which was the airfield for Calcutta, now called Kolkata, but I think it's still Dum Dum's the airfield. And they called there for fuel. And when they took off, one of the Javelins had an engine failure, and so it proceeded to crash into the Ganges Delta. Now the Ganges Delta, you might think, oh, that's easy to find, it's the mouth of a river. But the Ganges is not just like any old river, it is big. And the Ganges Delta spreads for miles and miles. It's almost the size of Wales, I think, at some stages. It's absolutely massive. It's muddy, it's tidal, it's got crocodiles, it's got land crabs, it's got all sorts of things, tigers and things, and not a good place to parachute down into. And the two crew ejected from their aircraft, which then disappeared into the water, or the mud, and the pilot unfortunately got hooked up with his parachute harness in the trees and didn't survive. But the navigator did. At that stage we didn't know. Then someone in Calcutta said there's a beacon, an emergency beacon working, so we knew that at least one of them was alive. So we took off from Singapore and we flew straight from Changi northwards to the Ganges Delta, which joins, it's got India on one side, and it's got, it was then called Eastern Pakistan, but it's now called Bangladesh, I think, on the other side. And they sort of met in the middle. So we weren't sure which half he was in, but we went up there searching for the beacons. The beacon, or maybe two. In the end, we didn't get a signal that night, so we landed ourselves to refuel. And then we discovered that where the local people thought the crash had happened was on the eastern side, which was the Pakistan side. So we re-sighted to Dhaka, which was their equivalent airfield just across on the edge of the Delta. So we went to Pakistan and refueled and then went off again. And this time we actually got a signal on not just the beacon, the beacon that originally the Pakistanis said there's someone there, but we can't locate it. But if you've got a beacon sending a signal and you're in an aircraft, if you fly towards it, the signal gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And as you fly over it, you get a dead spot, and then the moment you've flown past it, you get a high one again. It's a bit like flying through a donut, if you imagine that. The centre is where your aircrew is sitting in a tree, it appears, we discovered, with his beacon, and the signal gets louder and louder and louder, and then drops and then comes off loud again. So we were able to track it that way, and then you fly around and come in from another direction, and you do it again. And the navigator's getting a succession of dots on his plot, so even in the dark you could actually find it again, because you keep coming back to that mark on the plot. So we did that, and in fact we then dropped over. We couldn't see him. He wasn't. If he was waving, we weren't seeing him. We were all looking, but he was in a tree, and I think that all the foliage, like a sort of palm leaves and stuff, covered him. But we were still getting his signal. So we dropped what we called the Lindholm gear, which was 5 containers all linked with a buoyant rope. So if you dropped it into the sea or into the tide coming up, it would bobble and float. It wouldn't sink without trace. In the middle one of those 5 containers was a large dinghy with all sorts of lovely goodies, like a radio and lights and cigarettes and cans of water, all sorts, in that centre one. And the other 2 outwards had other supplies in it. So if we could get that line across his tree, he could pull in the line and get any of the up to 5 containers close to him. That's what we were hoping. He's been there for a couple of days. We were hoping he was A, alive, and B, able to do this. Because the beacon was going to work continuously until the battery ran out anyway. He didn't have to switch it on and off or do anything like that. Anyway, we then went back to Dhaka to refuel and spoke to the Pakistani Air Force and said, we haven't actually, we can't land, and he's 150 miles away or something from you. Can you get a boat out there? And they said, well, we can do, but it's going to take a while because there's no direct route. It's all sort of squidgy and tidal and horrid. They said, but we do know a Mr. Crisp, who is a mad pilot who has a little seaplane. It's quite small. It was a Grumman Goose, I think it was.
Biggles.
Kind of chap. He'd left over from the Second World War, didn't want to come back to England for some reason, and he had this little seaplane, and he would do little jobs for people. If they wanted a taxi route or something, he would take them. So they had a word with him, because they were servicing his plane on the quiet to keep him airborne. And Mr. Crisp, bless his heart, said, yes, I'll go and get him for you. And we showed him on the map. So he said, well, you take off and fly around. And then when you get there, over him, flash, we had an Aldis lamp, we could send messages, so we could flash that lamp towards him coming in from the north, and then fly around and flash it again. Whenever we were over him, he said, and I'll keep steering till I get to him. So he's coming over in this little seaplane, and there's no straight bit of water for him to land on. So he lands in sort of an S-shaped piece of river, and we were all fingers crossed and thinking, he's never going to make it, he's never going to make it. And if he does make it, he's never going to take off again. Anyway, he stops, he taxis up to the tree, and Tony, we then knew the navigator's name, Tony, stepped out of the tree and into the boat, into the back of the seaplane, and virtually kept his feet dry. And Mr. Crisp flew him back. But when he took off, he hit his wingtip on another tree and knocked a bit off the end. So this plane's limping, we stayed around like a mother hen around it to make sure we got it to safety. So it went back to Dhaka and he landed, and of course he was a hero. I took photos of him, which you might find on the website, yes. Newspaper, Singapore Straits Times got it, and filmed him and Mr. Crisp, that was, and our Tony Melton, we discovered was the master navigator, and he had a health check and he was okay. I mean, he was a bit dehydrated, he'd been there for over 2 days, but he was okay, and he had to get back to Singapore, or had to get to Singapore, so we said we were flying back with us the following day, which we duly did. But overnight, the Pakistani Air Force had repaired Mr. Crisp's seaplane. It's the only seaplane I've ever seen which was old and looking frightfully shabby and faded and rusty, with a shiny metal wingtip where all night the Pakistani engineers had beaten out some tin and made him a nice shiny wingtip for his thing. When we got back, our captain recommended Mr. Crisp for an award, and he actually is one of the few civilians to get the Queen's Award for valuable service in the air. And he obviously got a big crest and a huge certificate, which I should think he probably put it inside his airplane and flew it around for his passengers to look at. But that was that story, and that had a happy ending. And Mr. Melton retired from the Air Force later on and went to Kent. And he died in Kent, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, 90 odd. So he got a few extra years from 1961 through to, must have been about 2015, something like that. So that was definitely one up for us. The search and rescue, we managed to do that. Right, so in 1961, August, 8:05 in the evening, we took off after we got all the information that we could get. Flight Lieutenant Bennett was the skipper, I was the air electronics officer, which we've spoken about before, and we went from Changi in Singapore up to the Ganges for search and rescue, and then we landed in at Dum Dum. So we were airborne all the time for 5 hours of daylight and 10.5 hours at night. The other way round, we did the night first, didn't we? So we were 15.5 hours, so we flew up there, we searched on the way and then landed. And then we decided to move across to Dhaka in Pakistan, which is the other side of the delta. So it's only 45 minutes. So we took up from Calcutta, went into Pakistan, because that was going to be closer, and we had the Pakistan Air Force available there to help us with the search if necessary. So we needed that. That was a military presence, so we went to them. One of my sergeant signallers said, "I'm glad we left Dum Dum and went to Dhaka, because the Coca-Cola tins in Dum Dum are twice as much as they are in Dhaka." These logistics are very important. You've got to keep the crew happy. Anyway, off we go. After we repositioned, we refueled, and then we went off again at 2:40 for 5 hours. So we were much closer to the site. We were getting the beacon signal, and we went in there. But we had to mark it because we thought by the next day that beacon signal would have gone down, the battery would have failed. So we laid our 5 containers over the site so that when we went back the following day, if nothing else, we had a visual point to look for. So that was the Dhaka one there. And then we went back to Dhaka when it got dark. And then we went off again at 10 o'clock the following morning. And this was where we had... We dropped another container, actually, because we knew we were there at the right spot. And when we got there, we found that some of our 5 containers had definitely been moved. Now, we weren't sure whether that was the tide or whether Tony had done it, because Tony couldn't contact us directly. He was under the tree foliage. He couldn't climb up to the top. Presumably it was just twiggy at the top. So he was in a safe position halfway down the tree. So that worked out all right. And then we came back and they found this Mr. Crisp, this strange pilot with his little baby seaplane. And so we went up for that one. That was just to do that pickup, was here on the 8th. Just to pick up was very quick. 3 hours, 20 minutes, we were done it, seen the pickup and escorted him back at a slow rate whilst his little old seaplane came in, and then we were there. So that was all done. He was there after lunch. And then we left the following morning, 10:45, and we brought Master Nav Melton, the survivor, with us, as it shows in the logbook. And that was 7 hours, 55 minutes straight from Dhaka to Changi. On the way up, we had taken 15.5 hours, but of course we did a search on the way. So that's why it took twice as long. So that got us back to Changi. And then I had the rest of the month off, according to that. But that's how it was. We used to take a fortnight's leave as a crew. We'd all go off because the crew got used to flying with each other. So we would go and take a fortnight's leave, and the married ones would disappear with their families, and those who weren't married, I hadn't got married by then, so we would disappear off and do strange things. I went and did a filming expedition in the jungle for a fortnight at one stage, but that is a whole nother interview to be done at some other time.